So, well, hello everyone, my name is Pablo, and I work at Thoughtbot. And I thought coming today to talk a little bit about Ember Data. I first got in contact with Ember Data when I first got in contact with Ember a couple of years ago, three years ago now. And I tried to build this application that used the TFL API. Has any of you ever had a look at the TFL API? Yeah, it's not the most straightforward API to follow, but I was starting with Ember and I was reading the documentation and I was saying, oh, Ember Data is the thing to use. And I thought, well, then I will bend it to my will and make it work with the TFL API, which was a bit more complex than other APIs I had to work with, but at the end of the day, it wasn't really that bad, because once you understand Ember Data and how to figure out its code base, then things start to fall together relatively quickly. Originally, my talk was going to be called Understanding Ember Data. Then I renamed it into Ember Data because I thought, I think we should start from a higher vantage point and from a higher level of abstraction and then get in. At the end, I have to admit that the dive is going to be a bit shallow because there's only so much I can talk in 20 minutes. And there might be, who knows, a second part to this talk. So let's see how we get there. The reason why all this started is, and why I wanted to talk about Ember Data, is that something I see a lot everywhere is people who don't use Ember Data. Ember Data is supposed to be like a bit like the gold standard of dealing with data persistence in Ember. I mean, not necessarily the only one. There are other things like Orbit, but I see that most people just use a handcrafted Ajax service or something like that to download from their own APIs, because they consider that, well, Ember Data is just too complex for the use case. And this normally follows from another assertion that is JSON API is too complex for a use case. And the train of thought normally goes, oh, Ember Data requires JSON API, and we don't want a JSON API. And I think that both assertions need rethinking. First, Ember Data doesn't only work with JSON API. That's the first thing that should be understood. And the second thing is that JSON API is actually not that bad, because so people normally end up saying, people I've seen out there, doesn't necessarily include everyone, I end up saying, oh, we can do with a simpler response format, better suited to our use case. And I have built things like this before, like these APIs that start pretty much like this, where somebody says, oh, we only need to return a user, so let's just return the user in JSON. By the way, I know that's not strictly JSON, because I'm missing a bunch of quotes, but just bear with me there. And then the thing is that this project starts pretty well there, pretty nicely with that simple data exchange format. And then somewhere down the line, a couple of months later, you realize that you need to add, say, metadata to that. So you end up putting the person that it was being returning to its own, the resource was being returning to its own key, and then the metadata on a different key or something like that. I mean, you could also put it inside the object and underscore meta or something like that. But it doesn't matter. The thing is that you had to think about what you were doing and change the format to accommodate these new needs. And then somebody comes along a couple of months later and says, you see those skills, a list of strings, which incidentally correspond to some other data in our database and have their own IDs. You see, they shouldn't just be strings, because we need to correlate them with something else. So there should be a clear association there where we have the ID numbers, and we use that to query other stuff. And then again, you have gone and you have changed the format to be simple, but still adapt to your growing needs. And then, of course, there's the case where you don't want a single resource. You want a list of them, and it has its own meta, right? This meta is normally the pagination. That's probably the most common. Yeah, I think it's the most common type of metadata I see. Eventually, when you get a list of things, you are going to want to paginate them somewhere, somehow. So this is really complex stuff. This is real life stuff that we find and we accept. But then you end up re-implementing or redesigning something that's very much like JSON API. So why not going for a JSON API in the first place? Especially given that there are many third-party libraries out there that can handle JSON API for you, especially on the server. Like I can think of a couple of them for Elixir and Phoenix. One is called JSON API, and the other one is called JS, can't remember what. And there are a couple others for Ruby on Rails. I'm sure they are for Node. I'm not an expert there. So at the end of the day, if you just have one of those libraries and throw your data at it, 90% of the cases are going to be solved for you. And maybe you shouldn't be thinking so much about the simplicity of your data. And in many cases, when you think, oh, but that doesn't quite work with my use case, you thought well of that, because I find that often it's just a bit of making excuses. Anyway, and the thing is that even assuming that you want to use Ember Data and work with either JSON API or some other format that you have, that's fine. You end up having the problem that all that is very well documented, but it's a bit difficult to know where to start from. All the calls that you have in Ember and Ember Data, all the hooks that are given to you to make it work with your own data format are there, documented, but what does all that mean? What should be the first one I implement? And the truth is that Ember's code base is a bit complex. Like, I have tried to read it a few times, but I get lost in a back burner really quickly all the time. I don't know about you. I'm sure there are some hints I could take that will help me navigate a bit better. And those hints actually are the ones I want to try to deliver here for the case of Ember Data, because Ember Data's code base is actually relatively straightforward. And I want to try to guide you into how to get started with looking at Ember Data's code base. So the first thing we can do for that is remove Ember Data. And let's say we have a project, and we say, you know what? We are not going to use Ember Data at all. And the thing is that when you do that, there's something that still stays with you, and it is the store. Because the store is not really a part of Ember Data. Ember Data provides the store, but if you remove Ember Data, the concept of a store still exists in Ember. And what it does by default is that it loads models for you. What models if there is no Ember Data? Well, that doesn't matter. You can provide any models that you want. The way it works is roughly like this. You declare a route, and in this case we have a route that has a user ID at the end. So when you do that, Ember by default, let me rephrase that. When you do that, then you can create a route pretty much like this one, that does this.store.find user and reads the params. That's what you will normally do with Ember Data, right? And then what that store, well, actually I'm jumping a bit too fast. And then I said, but there's no Ember Data, but this .store still exists. And this default implementation of this .store that we get assumes that you are going to have something like that, a model in the models folder, or whichever way you have it that is going to be picked up by the injection stuff inside Ember. I just assume it can be just a POIO, a pure old JavaScript object. It doesn't even need to be an Ember service or anything like that. Just something that declares a find and assumes it's going to receive an ID and returns a promise. And you could get working with that. And you will say, well, Pablo, why will I want to do that and not just use my AJAX service that I have always been using and it works pretty well? Well, mainly because both things are not really in conflict. You can have both. You can implement that last model I put there using your AJAX service, and while you do that, you gain conventions, because the thing is that when you do that, Ember already assumes that you're going to do something like this .store.find. So in the code I had before, we can remove the part in the middle. We can just not have it because that happens to be the default implementation that Ember has of a route. So you can declare the route and you can have your model. And if you go to that route, hopefully you will have a template in it, and Ember will automatically do this .store.find of whatever was before _ID, which is user, and we are going to give them params the thing that had ID, user _ID. So suddenly you were not using Ember Data, but because you are following this convention that Ember expects of you, you have to write less code to do stuff. You can tentatively create a template here, a quick route there, and see how things work before getting on to creating more complex routes. And it will still work with your own AJAX service because you can declare the model at the end to use it. In fact, another thing you can do if we go one step further is that we can have our own store. And it is we could declare a service called store that works exactly as the store normally works, and it has a find that receives a type and an ID, and Ember will use it, although I'm cheating a bit because in order to get this to work you actually need to put some injections in place, and Ember Data does that. So Ember Data provides its own store service and then uses its initializers to inject some things in places so that works. So it is actually possible to do that without having Ember Data, but I didn't have the time to put myself together to show you exactly what you have to do, and it is slightly it is not relevant here now. Anyway, let's add Ember Data back, because this was just to see how can you follow the conventions of Ember Data without actually having Ember Data. By the way, those conventions are used by other data persistence libraries such as Orbit. Orbit provides its own store with its own store.find. So you see, and we will just be doing the same that other libraries are doing and Ember Data expects. Anyway, let's bring Ember Data back, and then let's try to read Ember Data, to dive into Ember Data's code and see if we can understand what's going on. So the first place, since we have been talking about the store, and the store is normally the first thing we touch when we deal with Ember Data. We do store.find or find record. Actually, that's something I forgot to say, and it is that we normally do find record instead of find. That's because find is not so much an Ember Data API, but rather a protocol that Ember expects these data libraries to implement. And Ember Data implements find by just pretty much aliasing it with find record. But anyway, where was I? We were bringing Ember Data back, and then I'm going to try to guide you into how to start reading Ember Data's code. And because we were at the store, we can start at the store. And if you do a little bit of looking up, you pretty quickly find where Ember Data keeps its store, right? And it is at add-ons store index.js. So it looks really promising. We go into it and we open it into our text editor, and we find we have to look in another file, because this is one of these imports that export, and this is the right place probably, but we have to dig one step down. Okay, so we go to the file that we were importing, add-ons private index, and we open it in our text editor. Oh no, this is another export that imports the export of the importing. Oh, okay, so it's fine. We're good. We just have to, that is the third line there, export default store from system store. Okay, but again, there's another file we have to follow, and it may feel a bit circuitous to follow this route, but at least it's straightforward. We know at every step where we're going. So we go to system store there, and we open it in our text editor, and voila, we actually have a store there. We have something called a store that is actually a service, and it's exported. So this must be the thing we're looking for. And in fact, this implements find the way I just described, and in turn calls find record the way I just described. So this looks like the place where we can start our little exploration of Ember Data. Or can we? Because maybe here we are on our text editor or on our GitHub, or on GitHub, reading all this code, but we don't really know if this is the place. Like it could be some other class that happens to have a similar interface and name, and one of these things that people do, and you end up looking at code that is not the code that you thought you were looking at. So, so how do you know if this is really what you think it is? Well, in order to get this sorted out, we can use NPM. NPM comes to the rescue here in the form of its command NPM Link. And what NPM Link does is basically takes a library, an NPM package that you have in your file system, and links it with your current project. So your current project is links it as a dependency of your current project. So your current project uses your local copy instead of a downloaded one from the NPM repository. And it's used a bit like this. Apologies for all those lines, but it's a simple example of how to use this. You will clone Ember Data yourself, and then you go into it and you say NPM Link, and then NPM does its own magic and says, okay, well, this person wants to be able to use this package I am in now as later in a different project. And then we go to our own project, and then we do NPM Link Ember Data, and then at that point our project will start using not the Ember Data downloaded from the NPM repository, but rather the one that we have in our file system. And then we can put a console log in there, and then we can have a go at seeing if this is what we were looking for, if this actually is going to work. And it works. You run this and you get the console message, so you know that you are in the right place, or close enough anyway. If you start using console log at that point, well, I say console log, but obviously you could be using something a bit more fancy, like the debugging tools that I'm not really familiar with. I'm more of a console log person, so that's the way I teach it. And from there you start thinking, okay, so what am I going to look for next? So what part of this code should I look for? And at this point it is enticing to say, well, let's go have a look at how find record works. But I'm going to say find record may not be the best place to start, because it does some clever stuff, especially with, well, given that find record makes pretty good use of the store cache, so it checks if what you're trying to find is in the cache, and if not, it retrieves it and does stuff with backburner. And I just cannot look into backburner. Really, somebody has one day to hold me into understanding how to read backburner using code. So instead, I would recommend that you have a look at store.query record. This is a better place to start because by its own nature, query record is not a very catchable thing, so it's a very straightforward in that if you follow the code, it goes quickly to the places where it actually retrieves it and serializes it and all that, and without so many intermediate steps. In fact, if in the file that we were already, if instead of going to find or find record, you go to query record, well, you see that you read the code and you see that internally is using something called underscore query record. Oh, okay, what is that? You go to the imports, you figure out where that is, and it's in that other file, and you're reading that, and then you see it uses something called normalized response helper. And this starts feeling a bit familiar, close to stuff that we have seen in the documentation. So you could say, oh, let's go into that and see if I end up in a serializer. And you're going to add on private, blah, blah, blah. And you see that indeed it uses serializer.normalized response. And at this point, we are in documentation land. We are in the kind of places that we expected. And also the kind of hooks the Ember Data provides and are well documented, but at the same time, when you read them for the first time, you don't even know what it's talking about. So it's a very good place to start putting console logs, and then everything starts making sense. So I've been talking for 21 minutes. I said I was only going to touch a bit shallower than I would have liked to. So I'm going to leave this little cliffhanger, and hopefully I will come back with a part 2 of this talk where I dive a bit deeper into Ember Data and try to figure out where things are. But with that, just using NPM Link and following this trail from query record, you will quickly end up in the code for serializers, for adapters, and it will be much easier for you to figure out how all that works. Thank you.